Welcome to another Dragonlance Saga creator episode. My name is Adam, and today I'm being joined by Amy Lee of Fantasy Fiction Fanatics. You can visit her website at fantasyfictionfanatics.net to find out more. Before we dive into the conversation proper, I would like to take a moment and thank the members of this channel and invite you to consider becoming a member by visiting the links in the description below. You can also always pick up Dragonlance gaming materials by visiting the affiliate links, also in the links below. Amy, thank you so much for joining me today. How you doing?
Great, thanks for having me today. How are you?
I'm great. So I'm sort of obsessive about fantasy in general, but specifically Dragonlance, obviously. And so whenever I just do random cursory searches for Dragonlance on the internet or on YouTube or something, I saw your content come up, and I sort of went on this little spiral of Amy and Fantasy Fiction Fanatics. So I reached out to you, and thankfully we could find some time to get together and have this live discussion. I appreciate you. For people joining live, thank you guys so much for tuning in live. I really do appreciate you. I do highly recommend you go check out Fantasy Fiction Fanatics YouTube channel. She is not solely about Dragonlance, so that is not the purpose of her channel. We're going to get into that a little bit more here in a second, but if you like Dragonlance, then you definitely like fantasy. So definitely go check out her channel for all of the different fantasy stories and deep dive analyses that she has on that channel. Chris, thank you so much for joining live. Lord Richard, thanks for joining. King J, what is up? Seems like everyone has, I don't know, high and mighty usernames. What? Oh, and there's Paul. So thanks, Paul, for joining live. All right, Amy, let's talk
Yes.
about you. How is your day going? How is Fantasy Fiction Fanatics going for you?
My day is going great. I'm here talking to you, which is a really big honor. Thank you again
Oh,
so much for asking me. It really meant a lot.
yeah.
And overall, I think Fantasy Fiction Fanatics is doing great. I'm in general a smaller channel, even though I've been doing it for almost 5 years now. But that's okay. I enjoy the people who watch me, and we have good conversations about fantasy, and that's all I can really ask for is just to have fun with people.
One thing I like about your channel is that it's not the totality of just on YouTube. I mean, you do have Discord where you can have conversations. You have a website where you talk about fantasy and stuff. So it is more than just video content creation. Is that sort of a plan that you had going into it of wanting to create this sort of in in my business side of life, they refer to it as omni-channel experience, where you have sort of an in-store and online experience. In your particular case, it is all online, but it's in different avenues. So did you plan on having this sort of omni-channel experience with one-on-one interaction with Discord or different social media platforms, and then a sort of a broader conversation with your website and presentation through YouTube?
Actually, that was not my intent at first. I really did just start doing the YouTube channel based on a suggestion from a friend of mine who was like, "Oh, I think, since you want to be a fantasy teacher, I mean, you don't have your license to be able to do that right now or your master's. So you could do YouTube and, you could practice and share your love that way or whatever." So I just started with YouTube and I did YouTube for about 3 years. I'll say at the beginning, I wasn't totally like, as committed to it as I am now. Like it was
Yeah.
more of a something that I was just doing as a side project. And if I did it, I did it. If I didn't, it might have gone a while. But then I started getting really serious in about 2020 and had some suggestions from my parents like, oh, hey, you could do book reviews and things like that and start a blog. And so then I made the blog and I really am enjoying doing the blog. It wasn't something I originally thought of. It was more of based on that suggestion of doing book reviews and starting one.
Yeah.
And then I made the Discord also based off a suggestion from a subscriber of mine saying like, oh, I think it'd be really cool if you had a chat. And I was like, Discord would be awesome. Like, let's do it. So just kind of based on what other people thought would be cool is kind of what I took in. And then I was like, yeah, that'd be actually excellent. And I've had a lot of fun doing it.
I think that's great. I mean, one side of all of this, whether it's just a hobby of content creation or whether it's something that you're sort of practicing for a professional end of instruction, um, getting feedback is massively important, and then listening to it. I think as any creative individual, and certainly writing and presenting is steeped in the creative side of life, being able to take constructive criticism and sort of channel that to making actual change can be a little bit painful and awkward, and it's not always a welcomed experience. For those of us who do really genuinely appreciate it, it can actually be a wonderful tool of growth. Did you ever find it difficult taking any sort of criticisms about your videos or the direction that you should take the content that you create?
Um, yes, I mean, it's always going to be a little bit hard to take criticism or to think like, oh, hey, you're not doing as good as you could be doing. That's
Yeah.
always sometimes hard. But I will admit, I have. So, all the way back from when I was in high school, I really enjoyed writing. And kind of another thing that I hope to do eventually in the future is to be a fantasy writer. And I really enjoy writing. And I used to show my writing to my dad in particular, both my parents, but my dad. And my dad's very critical person, not like in a bad way, but like he's not like the kind of parent that's like, oh, you're my daughter and you do everything perfectly.
Yeah, yeah.
He gives real feedback. And there have been several times where like I'll give him something I've written and he just completely marks it with all the red pen and destroys it. So I would say I've gotten a tougher skin for criticism and can learned a lot more of the value of criticism from all of that. So it's a little bit easier for me now with doing my channel to be able to hear feedback and to absorb it and to hopefully give better results afterward.
I think that's an invaluable tool. I mean, in life in general, but specifically as a parent, also to sort of set up your kids for success. I've got two kids, and I am completely honest with them to sometime to their absolute like rage. They don't really appreciate it, but
Exactly.
you try to soften the blow. You don't want to hurt their feelings, but you do want to let them know, where they're maybe doing a little two-step or misstep or backwards or something. Um, as a professional, it's something you have to take. It's not even an option. It's something that
Yeah.
we all understand that everything that we do is not going to be accepted in the brightest light by everyone who ever views it. And so understanding and accepting that, then when people actually give you negative feedback or constructive feedback that maybe you weren't expecting, or maybe you thought you did a really great job, and then suddenly they say something to the contrary, you can take it on the chin, and it's important to understand that, and to use it as a tool for growth rather than something to hurt you and make you drown your sorrows in suds of beer or something. I don't know.
I definitely agree. I would say that that's something though at the time was really hard for me especially when I was younger,
Yeah.
to take in, especially from my dad, who I really admire and want him to think I do great.
Yeah.
But I will say now in my life, I'm like, thank you. That was a very, very good, valuable lesson that I was taught to be able to take the criticism and to have a thicker skin and to realize that it's to help and not to just make you feel bad about yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Wouldn't that be the worst? They're just trying to put you down. Like, God, I thought you were my dad. I thought you loved me. So, I want to ask, because the entire channel is based around fantasy fiction, right? I mean, that is
Yes.
the premise of everything. I grew up in an era where fantasy was not really, it was sort of being a sort of nerdy person. It was is relegated to the nerdy side of life. There's a clear resurgent nowadays of accepting fantasy as a sort of mainstream idea. But what made you think about fantasy as the concept of your channel?
Um, I absolutely love fantasy. Like I will say, reading especially, it's my favorite thing to read. And I've liked fantasy since I was a little kid. Both my parents are really into fantasy. In fact, Dragonlance was introduced to me by my dad. Um, and my mom read it to me,
Nice.
well, to both of us, because my dad wanted to be there to listen to it again.
Oh man, that's awesome.
So that's something that's always been part of my life is fantasy, and I just absolutely love it. So to me, for writing, I've always wanted to be a fantasy writer. For reading, it's all about fantasy for me. So when I wanted to make this channel, there was no other option other than for it to be fantasy because I just love it that much.
So, what was your first introduction into it? Was it the stories of Dragonlance? Was it film? Was it TV? Like, what was your first breakthrough other than the Dragonlance novels?
I think at least the most distinct memory that I have is that my mom, when I was, I think, starting out when I was 7 or so, started reading me the Harry Potter series.
Oh, nice.
She read me every single one, and I do even remember like when book 7 came out, we pre-ordered it from Barnes and Nobles and we picked it up, and my mom started reading it me on a road trip because it was my whole family was going on this road trip, and
That's
she was reading
great.
it to all of us on the way to San Francisco. We were driving to San Francisco, so that I think was my real first um, experience with fantasy. Like I really started to fall in love with fantasy from that first reading that she was doing me. And then after we finished Harry Potter, that's when we moved on to Dragonlance.
God, I love that so much. I think Harry Potter did for fantasy what Star Wars did for sci-fi. It just completely dominated the genre, and no one can think of the genre without reflecting back on some sort of moment or experience. I was already an adult when um, Harry Potter came around, so I was, sort of reliving the films with my kids for the first time when they initially came out. But it was so massive, you could not be influenced or affected by the wave of Harry Potter in the day. When you
That's true.
reflect on fantasy, it's sort of, and again, it is such a huge construct. It's a genre that
Yeah.
just sort of goes everywhere. Do you have boundaries around it? So you run into genres that are like sci-fi fantasy. Let's try to combine the two. Do what for you is just not quite fantasy? It's not grounded. How do you define those boundaries if you could?
So for me, I'm pretty much a pure fantasy person. I did do one story based on a subscriber did commission me to do the Locked Tomb series. It has 2 books out right now, and it is kind of a mix of fantasy and sci-fi. And I hadn't
Hmm.
read it beforehand, so I didn't realize it was quite so sci-fi-ish. Otherwise, I might not have chosen to do it.
Yeah.
But for me, I'm pretty much a traditionalist on fantasy. I'm not big into like futuristic elements in it. I'm not really into the like any of the sci-fi elements at all, and I'm usually pretty much just a magic or an urban fantasy and the fact like fantasy that's happening in our world. So I'm pretty much a traditionalist with fantasy is magic, not technology kind of
Yeah.
deal.
When when you think about the myriad of fantasy authors that has inspired you, I mean, you've gone from appreciating the genre to wanting to actually instruct others in it and potentially write your own. So, who are your biggest fantasy influences?
I'd say I have a list of like 3 top uh, authors in my opinion. The first one is going to be Jim Butcher. He does urban fantasy, and he's one of my all-time favorite authors. He does both urban and high fantasy, depending on what series you read. And then I also really love Patricia Briggs. She's another one that writes both urban and high fantasy, but I'm more familiar with her urban fantasy works. And then the last ones would be the combined authors of Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. I've read a lot of their different series, and they
Yeah.
always write such amazing things. So that set of 3, I think, inspire me the most, and they're my absolute favorite authors.
For someone who doesn't understand, what is the difference between urban fantasy and high fantasy?
So high fantasy would be like Dragonlance. It's in a completely fantasy world. It's not really connected to our world in any way, shape, or form. And then urban fantasy, I would usually define as something that happens in modern day Earth, but has fantasy elements in it. So, for example, Jim Butcher does a series that's about a wizard who lives in Chicago, and he's a private investigator who does
Oh,
special cases
yeah.
where he has to investigate. So that would be an urban fantasy where it happens in our world, but it has magic and it's got fairies and it's got all the mythical creatures in there.
Very cool. You know what that reminds me of is Clive Barker with his like Harry D'Amour character. Have you ever read any of his work?
I actually haven't heard of him.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
I guess I
There's a
need to get
whole
on that
new
right now.
world that you should, yeah. Suggestions, just put it at the bottom or maybe the top of your list. Some of the greatest fantasy. He does, I mean, it's primarily horror, what he's known for, but he does
Hmm.
some really amazing urban, now that I know the phrasing, urban fantasy. And yeah, I think you'd probably dig it a little bit. All right, so just quickly for the chat, Richard, The YouTube channel is Fantasy Fiction Fanatics. Just search that and Amy will come up. Uh, Verigert apparently likes Locked Tomb as well. I personally have never heard of it, so I'm going to have to look into it.
Like I said, I didn't know about it until after I
Yeah,
was asked to do it. So,
that's
but it's a
cool.
very interesting story.
So when you first sort of dipped your toes into the content creation pool here of YouTube, did you always think it was going to be examining other writers, or did you think maybe you would just present your own work in that forum?
At least when I started it, I hadn't ever thought like presenting my own work at that time. Yes, I was. I actually have a degree in creative writing, so I was wanting to be an author even then, and that's what I
Mm-hmm.
was studying for. But when I was doing the actual YouTubing, I didn't have any particular works that like I had ready or anything I wanted to present.
Yeah.
So for me, I really was thinking about it more in the context of me wanting to be a college professor, because being in college and being a creative writing degree, there is no fantasy. There is no genre fiction writing like romance, anything like that. They don't teach you that.
Mm-hmm.
That's not offered, at least in my school. I don't know if other colleges have a lot of that, but I just thought that was such a shame, especially because a lot of the other people around me in my classes also wanted to do either fantasy or other kind of genre writing, and it's
Right.
a large part of the bookstore and a lot of what people read. But they mostly just taught you literature and study literature and through how to write literature. And so I really would like to be a college professor to provide that for other people like me who want to write fantasy, not just literature.
That'd
So
be.
that's what I was kind of thinking with my channel, was I would be practicing to be a teacher like that.
I mean, that is clearly the presentation approach that you take of that this is a class, welcome to the class. And I always wondered about that. Did you ever think about sort of outlining your own curriculum of where would your beginning, mid, and end of a year course sort of take you? And if you did ever do that, what do you think, if we could maybe just do a little bit of brainstorming here, what do you think that would be? Those sort of milestones of creative writing.
I think it also depends on what kind of classes that I would eventually be constructed on. Like, I think that it would be separate for the writing portion, like teaching creative writing
Mm-hmm.
for fantasy, as well as the reading analyzing. I think if I did like a year, I would probably do 4 books during that school year. I think that's a reasonable amount of books to really dive into. I don't think I'd be able to dive into it as deeply as I do with my channel, because you have more restricted time
Yeah.
in order to do that. So I do think I would have to maybe do a little bit of larger chunks depending on how big the book is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think that that would be what I would probably do, is I'd probably pick 4 main books that we would study the curriculum of, diving into the characters, diving into the setting, diving into how the author writes different things, and how we as a reader absorb it, and what we think is important in the story, and what we think is we're trying to get out of that. So for a reading portion, which is kind of mostly what I do with the channel, I would say that's kind of about how I would look at it.
Okay. I always wonder, sort of reflecting on the course structure of everything, how you would differentiate a fantasy course versus a romance course or something like that. I mean, because the writing structure is is always going to be sort of universal, is it?
Right, right. So I would say you have to have the foundation of being able to write well.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's going to be more in like a generic
easier said
creative
than
writing
done.
class. Very much easier said than done. But as far as like, it's more about the tropes and the rules behind the genre. So like if you're writing a romance, you're gonna have to teach them like how you can set up the characters meeting, the different kind of romantic settings they're gonna have to be in, and like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Versus fantasy, you have to decide, okay, if we're gonna make like a Dragonlance where it's a whole new world, you have to decide what your setting is. Like you have to make all the different places and locations. You have to decide the history, the religion, like you have to decide the magic system, and the magic
Yeah.
system can't just be whatever you want. It has to have some kind of rules to make it realistic. Otherwise people aren't going to take to it if it's like you get characters that can basically do whatever they want
Yeah.
and can just win no matter what. So there's all these different things that you have to take into account for writing a different genre, especially fantasy, with it being completely building it from the world up,
Mhm.
that it would be easier to teach people, or to help people learn how to do that by teaching them.
Yeah, the world building, it's got to be like the 101 course, right?
You're
Like that's
right.
what it's all about. If you don't have that structure initially, then you're kind of just flying by the seat of your pants, and who knows where it'll go, or whether or not it'll be even entertaining. Um, do you think fantasy works best when it falls back on familiar human tropes? Dragonlance specifically, there's this universe behind it. There's a cosmology, there's a deep history to it before we're ever even introduced to characters in the modern time. There's this era of, well, there's this great cataclysm in the past, and this is hundreds of years after that where people are, in the age of despair. So, we've clearly had moments of darkness and despair in our own human world, recent and distant past. So, does fantasy work best, in your opinion, when it reflects human experience that we have had, or when it sort of breaks beyond those bounds into aspirational ideas?
I think it's a mix of both, and the fact that obviously with fantasy, we do have this whole world building that kind of does, it simulates life, and the fact that, like you said, like we've had the cataclysm, we've had history that's really devastating, and that's made who we those characters are in the present day different,
Mhm.
based on the history and everything. So I think that that's really important to have in fantasy, because we have to be able to relate to it. We have to be able to see, at least for me personally, I find the fantasy that I enjoy the most are the ones that have those human struggles and those human,
Yeah.
ideals behind it. And then we're building up from that to have these great characters that are going beyond that with the fantasy elements, or that are learning to, use those fantasy elements to, complete their journey. So it's more about the background is, or the essence is the same thing, but then we have this epic journey that could not happen in real life. That is the imaginative part that breaks beyond our regular experiences.
Yeah. Um, you know, Buried underneath all of this conversation is the act of reading, and I personally think it's incredibly important. It's one of those activities where it is a very solo, intimate experience, but then you also get an opportunity of sharing with. We like to aspire to be able to communicate what we've read, and connect with other people who also like the same similar type of literature. Um, why do you think reading is important? At the base level as a human being, but also as a someone who creates content. Why is reading important to you?
It's actually going to be a little bit of a tough question for me, because it's kind of the same question as like, why do you like fantasy? In my opinion, for me personally, because my go-to answer is because it's amazing, because I love it, and it's not really an answer to the actual question. It's just, you're wanting to know why.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to express the feelings, and the experiences of it. I truly just think that reading is pure imagination. Whether you do read literature, and that is for you, or you read fantasy. And I think that that is something that I cannot experience in any other form. And the fact that, when you're, watching something, if you're reading a comic, if you're doing anything else that has visuals or audio, it's not quite the same as the imagination of reading it for yourself and deciding what that means for you, having your own interpretation of the characters based on how you read it. And so I just think reading gives, an experience to anybody who at least enjoys reading that you can't get from any other medium. And I think it's, like you said, it's very much a, solo experience, and that can't be replicated by anybody else. And I think that that is pretty, amazing in and of itself.
Yeah. Do you think our culture is shifting away from the act of actually reading a physical book? I mean, of course, it will always be there as long as there are physical books. But we have seen this massive shift initially to ebooks, which is virtually the exact same thing, and then we've seen this massive shift even more to audiobooks, and with the prevalence of really engaging stories in different streaming platforms that are just pervasive nowadays, is traditional grabbing a physical book and reading sort of going the way of the dodo, do you think?
I can't ever say that it's going to go 100% away. I really truly believe that there will always be people who enjoy reading out there. But I do feel like us as a culture in general likes to have things easy and quickly.
Yeah.
Like we've even seen that with video content in a whole. Like for example, instead of movies, now we like TV shows because we can watch one episode and then come back later. Or with TikTok and these other ones that have like the YouTube shorts, it's like people want short content that they can just get in and get out and move on. So I do think that reading can be a lot harder for people now because you do have the quote, quote, easier methods of enjoying a story or the quicker methods when people are busy doing things in their life or not wanting to pay attention to something that long. So I do think, unfortunately, it is less popular than it has been in the past. I don't know if it'll ever go away. I truly hope not. I think there are enough people to that still enjoy reading to keep it going, but I do think it's definitely lost a lot of its popularity, which is a shame. I do think everybody could enjoy reading if they found something that interests them enough. But I don't know if people really choose to want to explore that enough.
I think that's the biggest, most important point is the exploration aspect of reading. I've read military field manuals when I was in the army. You know, I've read old school American literature when I was in school, fantasy on my own terms, and sci-fi because I wanted to explore some stuff, horror because I'm obsessive. I've never actually read like a straight up romance, but I have read books that have heavy romance in them. So I think it's really important as an individual to not just lock yourself into to one genre. I mean, that's I'm clearly talking to someone who is making an entire YouTube channel and a future
But I
curriculum
still
over
like
on fantasy.
I still like some other genres. It's not
Yeah.
like I only read fantasy. I do actually like straight up romances. And I do like some mysteries. It's just that my favorite, the one that I always come back to, has always been
Yeah.
fantasy.
Do you? I mean, when I think of what it means to be a human being, and as my outlook on the world is all about how can I be the best version of me as a human animal. Part of that is exposure. Part of to different ideas, different perspectives, different media. I mean, a lot of it is just what type of reading have I not experienced? Why is reading important to me? What does reading give me? So I guess, trying to extend that out to you because this is an interview, not all about me. What is it that you feel like you get out of reading and I don't know, maybe I'm teeing it up, but, challenging yourself to explore different genres and aspects?
What I get out of
Yeah.
reading is just, for me, pure entertainment. That's one of the things that I really just don't like literature, and unfortunately, that's what I had to study when I was in
Oh,
college.
no.
But I just don't like the kind of stories where it's like you have to dive deep into the story to like even get anything out of it. Otherwise, it's just boring.
Oh, man.
So for me, like when I read, what I really enjoy about reading and what I feel like I read for is purely for entertainment. Not saying that I don't get deeper meanings out of things. Like, I mean, obviously, I'm talking about fantasy and the deeper meanings and things like that
Yeah.
on this channel.
Yeah.
But I originally am reading for the enjoyment of the story, and then I get those deeper things by immersing myself in that story because I'm enjoying it so much and wanting to know more about it and wanting to find those things in there. So I always start, for at least for reading, is just to enjoy the experience of it and to enjoy the story that's being told.
Yeah. Question from the chat room here. Is it tough to find a balance when world building as to how much detail to include? Some books they've read is difficult to enjoy because they put too much in it. So what is that balance, do you think, between just enough or too much?
I think that's a hard question in the fact that I think a lot of it depends on the reader and it depends also on the writer. So some writers I think can do really well doing those extra details and they know exactly how to place them and where to place them. And it's kind of like a superhuman skill that they somehow seem to know. And then there's those that readers that don't like those extra details and like the deep immersion. An example might be, I don't know if you've ever read the Sword of Truth series, but they are very thick, dense stories, and they are all about the details.
Right.
And for me personally, I like the story enough to get through all those details, but I can read one and then I have to take a long break. So the story is good enough and the world is good enough to enjoy those world building details that are so much. But I think in general, I think it just depends on what kind of reader you are, because I know some people who love the Sword of Truth books and they just dive right in there and they love all those little details.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little bit of a mix, both of knowing the line for, as the writer, how well you can write it, that people will enjoy all those details, versus also the reader of what kind of books you enjoy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it totally does. I think I would probably take the approach of what exactly is it that the story is trying to feed you, right? I mean, are we talking about current events
Right.
that are informed by past events, or is this current events that are entirely dependent on past events, and that should, you know, possibly be a place to guide you? It is a very open-ended, you know, question to interpretation, so I do really appreciate that. Maybe we could steer a little bit towards some more Dragonlance here, because this
Yeah,
is a
of
Dragonlance
course.
channel. So did you initially decide to start talking about it because those are the books that you were talked about, you know, you were read to by your parents? What was it about Dragonlance specifically that made you want to maybe have conversations about it?
So I did Dragonlance as my very first book on my channel. So it was my first ever full video was starting with the first book of Dragonlance. And honestly, I just sat down and I was like, okay, my channel, I want to make this channel about fantasy and talk about books, but I don't want it to be where it's just a mainstream channel where, you know, I'm talking about Twilight and talking about Harry Potter and talking
Yeah.
about Lord of the Rings and all the ones that like everybody knows and everybody's interested in. I wanted it to be something where like I want to talk to people who really like reading fantasy, not just mainstream fantasy, but really love reading fantasy.
Mhm.
And so I was like, what do I start with? Well, I was like, what is what do I think is a classic fantasy story? What do I think of when it's the most classic thing you can think of when you think of fantasy? And for me, the classic idea of what fantasy is like a Lord of the Rings or a Dragonlance or a something like that. That's an epic journey. It's got
Yeah.
dwarves, elves, you know, different kinds of beings in there. So I didn't realize Dragonlance was very popular. I was thinking that this was something like, not saying that it's unknown, but I just didn't think
Right.
it was like everybody knows about like Dragonlance if you like fantasy. So I just thought that's a classic, good, solid story to talk about fantasy. It's for me, a classic fantasy type story that would have a lot to talk about for it.
Yeah.
And so that's why I picked it, was because I love it. And I felt like I've read it 5 times or 6 times by that point.
Yeah.
So I know it well enough to talk about it. It's pretty classic in my opinion of the kind of story that it is. And I thought it would be a really fun dive into.
So you had mentioned, you know, what should you start with, and you mentioned Lord of the Rings. Whenever anyone I've ever talked to thinks about fantasy, Lord of the Rings is like the granddaddy in the room. Um,
Yeah.
is there is there a reason you didn't tackle that initially as the first one, or is it just you were just comfortable with Dragonlance?
There's a couple reasons. So one is because again, that was, to me, that seemed like mainstream. Like everybody talks
Yeah.
about Lord of the Rings. Everybody's
Yeah.
knows
Especially
about
nowadays.
Lord of the Rings. I wanted to do something different. But then also, this is a little bit sacrilegious to say, but I don't totally love those books. I
It's
think the
okay.
movies are amazing, but I find the books very hard. I feel like they're kind of boring. So um,
You have to
the
fend off the
Hobbit's great, but
pitchforks.
the actual Lord of the Rings trilogy is so hard to slog through, in my opinion. It's very slow moving. So to me, that's the other reason, is that the books aren't as enjoyable for me.
I think that's a big part of fantasy I mean, arguably about any literature, but if we're talking fantasy, in general, is that you have authors that are so detailed about every minutia of the universe that they created, and this feeds into conversation we've already had here in a little bit. That it does become a bit of a slog if you're just trying to dip your toe in and have a good read. J.R.R. Tolkien is one of those that he had it all figured out before he put pen to paper. I mean, he had languages written.
Right.
That's a next level type writer there. I mean, there's people who
Yes.
just rough out some world building stuff and then just dive into the story, and there's other people who have every single thing put down, and he's just one of them. Yeah, he was one of the last fantasy authors I ever explored. Because it was just one of those things where it was pervasive. I already knew the stories before I ever picked a book up, and it was just that I don't know. Like I enjoyed other authors, so I'm kind of with you. I personally think J.R.R. Tolkien is a little overrated, maybe a little more than a little, but
Yeah.
he is sort of the granddaddy, and so you always got to tip your cap no matter what. Apparently,
I mean, they did great with the movies, and I will admit, so since I'm younger, and the fact that the movies were, I think the first movie came out when I was like 8 or 9.
wow, I
So
feel
I
old.
so I grew up watching the movies before I tried to tackle the book, and it's like
Right.
the movies are so much more faster paced, and you're more in the action and
Yeah.
the excitement, and then the book is just like, okay, we're going to the next
Yeah.
tree. Okay, we took maybe 5 steps. All right, let's another 50 pages. Oh, we're still not there.
Yeah.
So it's I think that's part of the reason is it's just so much of a slower move compared to what I was used to for what Lord of the Rings should have been.
Yeah. So this feeds right into Chris's comment. Is he's only read Lord of the Rings and a few others, so he's interested in your thoughts about how Dragonlance compares to other fantasy settings. And so let's sort of open it up, not just with Lord of the Rings and Dragonlance, but how do you think Dragonlance compares to other fantasy worlds that you have presented on your channel specifically?
I would say I think Dragonlance is one of the best fantasy worlds you were gonna find, honestly. At least for high fantasy or something that's completely a fantasy world. I think it's the one that has the most detail. I think it's the one that's got a lot of the most um, variety on like what you've got,
Yeah.
especially for the ones that I would say I've done on my channel. The other one that's a really more popular high fantasy that I've just recently finished doing is the Belgariad series by David Eddings. And that one's another epic journey, fight against evil kind of story. But they don't have like, like dwarves, elves, like, they do have some other beings, but that's mostly human based,
Yeah.
and they've got the gods and stuff. But I would say that Dragonlance has the most immersive, most diverse kind of world there is, at least for a lot of the main series that I've read. So there's a lot of other good worlds out there, but I
Yeah.
do think that Dragonlance is one of the ones that has done the best, and it's got the most fullness and the most to explore with it.
Yeah. So, you've done a bunch of deep dives into not just the story of the Chronicles of Dragonlance. You talked about specific characters. One that I was just stunned by is you did a deep dive on Boo. Like, like
That was actually a request from a subscriber, so I had to work a little bit on that one, but I made
yeah,
it work. But yes, I had somebody who specifically asked for that one, so I went back and I reviewed what I thought about Bupu and did a dive on her as well. It was actually kind of refreshing. It's not someone you would think of to do a dive on, so
yeah.
I thought actually was pretty interesting to come out and actually think about her a lot.
Well, I think that's interesting. The more I learn about your channel and sort of the direction you take is that you do take suggestions about what you're going to present.
Mhm.
I mean, just sort of compare and contrast here. If someone said, "Hey, Adam, make a whole video about Boo," I would say, "No, I will not. That's there's not enough information." But you took it on, so congratulations.
There are some that people have requested that I'm putting off for certain reasons. For example, Lord Soth, which I think is a really
Mm,
interesting character, but I would say that there's a lot of people have told me like, oh, like there's this other book that goes into detail about him, and I
right.
haven't read that one yet, so I'm waiting to try and see if I can read other stuff to do a better dive on him.
Yeah.
Or for like Raslin, I know everyone says on my channel I say that wrong, but
Okay.
I call him Raslin, and I'm waiting to do Test of the Twins before doing a character analysis on him,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
obviously that's the main set that's on him. I've also thought about possibly doing like a part 1, part 2, doing Chronicles and then doing Test of the Twins, but I haven't
Ooh, that might be interesting.
gotten that far. Yeah, but yeah, so like, so certain characters like that, I'm trying to wait till I get a little bit more detail or get to the meat of their character before doing the analysis. But I do try and take everybody who suggests. I'm always on my channel to tell everybody, hey, if you want to see something, let me know. I can't always do it, but I will always try.
Yeah. There's always that balance between, as a content creator, between what is desired of you versus what you're either have time or are capable of doing. And that's, especially when you dive into a new fantasy world, whether it's Tolkien or Dragonlance or anything, there's always a history of novels out there that are defining tiny little details about a character that are what people are asking you to talk about them for, but you may not cue into those like they do. One thing I've noticed about just producing this channel is how, as obsessive as I thought I was about a particular character or a particular event, there are always masses that are so much more obsessed about it than I ever was. And I've often found myself coming down on, well, who am I doing these videos for? Who am I creating for? Because ultimately I'm doing this because I enjoy it. And as soon as I stop enjoying, then I'll stop creating it. But I also want other people to enjoy it as well. And so that's the awkward balance of a creator, is that we're feeding ourselves and we're feeding other people as well. How do you land on that? Because it has to be a little bit intimidating, because one, you would have to do an insane amount of research before being able to encapsulate a character without knowing everything that's happened to them. But then the other side of it is that enjoyable for you? And, do you have to do a deep dive on everything that someone suggests in order for you to fulfill what they want out of it? So how do you land on the creator side of things? Are you doing this for them? Or are you doing it for you?
I'm doing it for both. I am doing it because I obviously enjoy doing it. Just like you, if I didn't enjoy doing it, I wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah.
But I also, so this is kind of something else that I have seen happen with my channel that I really, really enjoy. And that's also partly why I structure it as a class, is because in a college class, the whole point is to learn together. I won't say that's necessarily in high school or younger, but in a college class, you're basically all there to have the teacher facilitate discussions, and you're all talking about it, and you're all learning together by giving your opinions, at least for the classes that I've been in. That's the structure that it is. And that's what I want to come here to, is I might not know everything about this character. I might not even know a third about this character, or this book or anything. I bring what I see as important, or what I feel and I think out there. And then I always tell people in my videos, let me know what you think, or I'd love to hear your opinion, or let's learn together and figure it out together. And if you comment down below or somewhere else and let me know, hey, I think this, then I will respond right back and be like, oh, that's interesting. Or no, I think this because of this way, or whatever. And then it opens up the dialogue for a conversation. So that's why I also want to do things that other people want to do, not just what I want to do. So that way we can all have the kind of discussion that we want to have together, and be kind of a community that can talk about fantasy together.
I think that's a really important aspect of not just the college course, but also just an approach toward creating content on YouTube, is the learning together aspect. I mean, I always start my channels off with some version of, if I make a mistake or misspeak, leave a comment below, because ultimately what I want is that, the open and honest expression of, I don't know everything about this. I'm a fan, and that's the beginning and end of it. I'm just a fan. So if there's something that you have garnered from these texts, if there's a theme or an idea or a movement that has spoke to you that I maybe don't touch on because I just missed it, I was oblivious to it, then please inform me so that I can then also experience it through your eyes. This is, again, part of what I love about the human condition is how we interpret things, the same things, so wildly differently, because we're informed by, the individuals that raised us. We're informed by the culture we were raised in and the society that we were raised in. We see things so dramatically different. My old drill sergeant used to say, perception is 9/10 of reality, because we just experience life differently as individuals. And the extension of that in this context is presenting stories or characters in specific ways. What's the greatest challenge you find when creating this? Is it the process? Is it the research? Is it the presentation? What's the most challenging for you?
I think it's the actual recording of it.
Really?
Which is pretty interesting because I don't have a problem with like get recording, but it's always the sitting down and the recording that's the hardest for me. And to get going. Once I'm getting going, I'm fine, but sometimes I have to restart the recording like 3 or 4 times to finally get into a place where I feel like, okay, I'm in the zone. And I usually I do mine pre-recorded. I have thought about possibly doing live at some point, but at this point I just do pre-recorded.
Yeah.
And I'm talking for like 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how long my conversation is, by myself. So usually I
Yeah.
have to like take breaks in between, and I try and do a topic, take a quick break, do another topic. So for me, it's like every time I do a video, beforehand, I'll do either the reading of the section that I'm talking about and make my notes and make my outline of what I want to talk about, or I'll, outline what I think about my character and maybe do a little bit of research based on if I don't remember everything or I want to look something up. So every week, and that's usually the easy part for me. It's like I enjoy doing that. I enjoy the reading. I enjoy, making my notes and making my outline. But then when I sit down to record it, even though I have my outline and I know what I want to talk about, it's always the getting going and getting
Yeah.
started and feeling like I'm saying what I want to say. Sometimes that's the hardest thing, is I know what I want to say, but it's hard to then communicate it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it really comes down to that balance. And we can sort of compare it to the world building balance, right? Too much or too little, of how much do you want to script out what you want to say? How fluid and natural do you want it to be versus how scripted do you want it to be? Um,
Right.
I mean, you've seen the notes that I create here. I like to sort of just do outline notes as you've described that you do, and then just sort of
Right.
riff off of that idea so that it does feel more natural and fluid rather than scripted 100%. But then I do have episodes which are just like the weekly episodes I do that are just straight. I do the research, I write down the script, and then I, perform the script. And so there's a fair amount of editing involved with misspeaking and stumbling over different parts. And maybe I'm just not in a good emotional place. And so I have to sort of force myself to, change for the sake of recording the video and stuff. Um, is that something that you experience in your own, recording and stuff? Is if you just don't feel like it, do you just fight through it, or do you just sort of put it aside and come back to it later?
I will say always the part for me that's the hardest is, like I mentioned, the start.
Yeah.
So I will admit, like, before I'm gonna record, like I record every Sunday, and I know I'm gonna record every Sunday, and the whole part of like waking up on like a weekend and like kind of relaxing a little bit, and then it's like, okay, I gotta get up and I gotta film and I gotta I mean, I'm not a huge person that's like, oh, I have to like look really nice, but I want to look at least presentable if I'm gonna
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
on camera and here. So I gotta set up the lights, I gotta set up all my stuff.
Yeah.
So it's more of the daunting task of like I'm obviously doing work full time, so it's like this is my weekend and
Yep.
I'm still having to do all this work, and then I sit down and I'm like, okay, how can I just like everything's set up? Can I just take a quick break and pretend I'm going to record for myself? And but then once I get going, I feel like once I get the opening to where I like it, whether that's the first time around or if I have to restart myself maybe 3 or 4 times, once I get in the groove of it and I get going, then I'm okay. It's just the slog of having to force myself sometimes to sit down, put on the camera, and
Yeah.
just go.
So do you do a lot of editing to your videos, or do you just, once you get a take, you just use it?
Usually the only edits that I do is between where I take breaks. So obviously, like I said, since I'm talking so long by myself, sometimes I'll finish a topic and then I will, get a drink of water, breathe for a couple minutes, maybe look at my phone, and I record all that just so I don't have to reset everything up. But then I'll go okay, I'm starting again. Wait a second, and then I'll start going. And I usually just cut the edits of where I'm taking my little breather. So I don't do tons of editing, but I do have a little bit of editing between a couple of different topics.
Nice. Okay. Is there any fantasy novel or world that you're just a little too hesitant to tackle?
As far as hesitant, I don't know if I'm per se hesitant, but there are, like, for example, my favorite author, Jim Butcher, is one that it's hard to take on because it's the favorite of all time. It's like I would say Jim Butcher's my very top author, and there's 2 different series that I really like by him. And it's not that I don't want to talk about it, but it's because it's so special to me that it's like I don't want to do it wrong. And so those are the ones that are a little bit harder for me to say, let me go ahead and jump into that one, is because I don't want to do it wrong. And the fact that also, like, for example, for my book reviews, I have a new Mercy Thompson series is one of my favorites. It's by Patricia Briggs. And I did a review on one of her newer books. And I usually, when I post on social media, all that kind of stuff, I will let the author know that I did it. On Twitter, I'll do an @ in the author's thing,
cool.
so they can see it.
Yeah.
But on that one, even though I was saying how great the story was because I loved the book, I didn't tag her because I was like, what if I I wrote it badly? What if what if it wasn't a good review and they don't like it? So, so I would say in those ways, I'm hesitant because on things that I really love, because I don't want to mess it up.
I completely understand where you're coming from. Yeah. It's a little too close to you that what if. Yeah, I appreciate that. Question from the chat here from Timothy. Are you a Percy Jackson fan, and are you ready for the TV series?
I've not read any of the Percy Jackson, but I have watched one of the movie that they did of Percy Jackson, which I enjoyed. So I didn't know they were coming out with a TV series, but I definitely think that would be interesting to check out. I do know that the Percy Jackson series is supposed to be really good, and it is on my list eventually to read. I just have a long list.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing with any genre, but fantasy specifically for our conversation, it's so huge. Like, you just get lost in it.
Yeah.
The idea that there's a vocal Dragonlance fan base online. I have run into 2 people in my real life that have ever read Dragonlance. So,
Yep.
you get it online and suddenly you feel like you're being overwhelmed because, everyone is a Dragonlance fan, but in real life, no one's ever freaking heard of it. So that's fantasy in general. It's rough because you get those fandoms that are so tight and so obsessive. They just want you to share and they want to tell you all about every aspect of it. And then, the other side of that, you're just like, look, I want to, I want to sow my seed in the fantasy world here. I don't want to be bogged down in a 27 novel epic so I can appreciate it like you do. I mean,
that's true.
It's got to be challenging. Are there any other, so there's just a general question here for Michael. Are there any other shows you guys are looking forward to? Is there any fantasy show coming out? Because there are a number of them that are in production right now that you are particularly looking forward to.
Well, obviously there's the new Lord of the Rings series that's coming out. I mean, obviously that's kind of the basic answer. But I do think that that'll be interesting in the fact that it's supposed to be content that's like so brand new, like never before seen in this section.
Right.
I'd say that's the only one that I really know is coming out. There are obviously other ones that are currently coming out or have already come out partly, and then more seasons are coming out. But I would say at this point there's no fantasy TV series that's just really gripped my attention really hard, where I'm just like, I can't wait for more to come out. I feel like I'm in kind of this groove, not so much with reading, but at least with TV and movies, is I'm in a slump of where I'm like, nothing really seems new and exciting right now. I think I just need to find something that really grips my attention to kind of reel me back in. But at this point, I'm kind of in between, like trying to figure out what my next sink in is.
Yeah. Have you ever reviewed or done any dives into George R. R. Martin with Game of Thrones?
I've done 2 character analysis. I've done Cersei Lannister and I've done Jaime Lannister. They were both requested of me. But I've only seen the TV series, so I do always make a note
Right.
at the beginning
Yeah.
of those 2, is that it's not based on the book because I haven't read the book yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be another one of those, like Tolkien, where you just to get in, your foot in the door, you have to read so many novels, and it's not even finished. So, like, you
No.
can't even
And
get like a
no one's sure
totality.
if it's gonna be finished.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's one of them that I'm looking forward to. Those series that are coming out because, up until like the 5th season of Game of Thrones, I was really into it. I really appreciate it. I was a little bummed how it ended, but I didn't create it, so I can't really complain that much, It was
True.
other people's
Yeah.
money, other people's time.
Part of me, I'll be honest, was like, how would I want it to end? I'm not really sure how I feel like would be a good ending anyway for that story.
Yeah. See, and the worst part about it is, and maybe I'm just feeding into the zeitgeist, is that that's the end I always expected. I just didn't like how it got there. It felt rushed.
Yeah.
And
Rushed.
so I did always from the very beginning, I was like, oh yeah, that's clearly how it's going to end. Of course, that's how it's going to end. But yeah, I just felt a little rushed. And the fact that I had read the novels after the first 2 seasons. And so I had this sort of, there's a lot of stuff dropped and stuff like that. Let me ask you about that, because that's an interesting idea to bring. I know we're getting close to our hour here. It was funny just for the audience here. We were talking beforehand, like, I don't know how long this is going to go, but let's cut it off in an hour just in case. And we're at the hour and we still have stuff to talk about. What are some of the worst adaptations? And then, maybe what is the worst adaptation in your opinion from novel to film? And then what is the best novel to film adaptation? Do you have any idea of those?
I will say personally, one of my, like, right off the bat, what my worst adaptation was the movie version of Inkspell. That is a young adult novel, so I don't know if any of you guys have heard that, but it had Brandon Fraser in it, which was an excellent choice because actually the author dedicated the first novel as saying that that's who she saw that character as, was Brandon Fraser, but they did a horrible job with the actual movie. It was so sad. I was so excited for that one, and they really dropped the ball on it. So I would say that one was my least favorite that I can think about that I had top of my head, where I just absolutely hated the adaptation. Yeah. I guess I would say for my best adaptation for me personally would be Lord of the Rings, and the fact that I really did not like the books, but I love the movies. So I think that would be my choice for the best one.
Visually, they're just amazing. They're great.
Amazing, yeah.
So just to quickly respond to Michael here, what's the chance of a Dragonlance movie or TV series happening? Wizard of the Coast did announce that they are doing a sort of multiverse of both films and TV series, a number of them. So, I mean, I think it's possible. Whether or not it'll happen in the next 10, 15 years, maybe slim to none, but it's entirely possible. Whether or not they would make one. So, closing question, because this is Dragonlance channel, and I've taken way too much of your Saturday evening already.
I don't mind.
Appreciate that. Favorite Dragonlance character? What is your favorite Dragonlance character and why?
I've got 2 that are tied. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So anybody who's watched a lot of my Dragonlance videos knows that my top 2 favorites are Tasselhoff and Fizbin, and they are a pair, so it kind of fits. In fact, part of what inspires me to want to be a writer is because I would love to write characters that are as good as Fizbin and Tasselhoff.
Really?
Tasselhoff is a blast. I have so many people in my chats that are like, Tasselhoff is so annoying, and I'm like, no, he's amazing.
I was surprised by the hate Tasselhoff gets too. Yeah.
Like, he's hilarious all the time, and he's always the person that has like the brightest outlook on everything. Like, it's gonna be great. Like, let's just go on an adventure. Yeah. So I I just love Tass and Fizbin. I just love how, especially when it's the first time reading it, obviously, is you don't know who Fizbin is. He's just this kooky wizard that keeps showing up, and you know there's something about him because they keep dropping these hints that he's more than what he seems to be. But and then at the end, you obviously realize that he's a god, and you know exactly who he is. But I just love how he's always acting like this crazy person that you just know has this hint of he's somebody special. He's somebody who is actually very important. But he's just acting like an idiot.
So how far have you gone into the Dragonlance novels? I mean, is it just Chronicles, or have you done any of the other ones?
It's been a while since I've read some of the other ones, but I will admit, oh, sorry, I think I hit my mic.
It's okay.
I haven't read anything that's not by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. That is a little bit of, not because partly because I don't want to, and the fact that I feel like it's not the original people. How can they do a good job? But also partly is because, you know, there's just so many, it's hard to read them all. But I have read all of the ones that both Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman have written together. I haven't read some of the ones that Margaret Weis wrote on her own, but I've read all the way up to, I think that makes it Souls.
The War of the Souls, yeah.
Yes, so I think I've read all the way up to there. So I've read a lot of them.
So I saw that you were exploring some of their other shared universe works. Like Fizban breaks into like 3 of them, or 2 different ones.
Yeah, one of the best ones is the Deathgate cycle.
Yes, it's so good. Oh, it's so good.
And there's even like,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No.
I was going to say that there's this one time where he even mentions Tanis in the Deathgate cycle, and how I believe he mentions that he's even like taking a shower or something like that. It's like one of my favorite lines is he's talking like this tangent about Tanis. And it's obviously for people who read Dragonlance, you know what that is.
Yeah. I love so much that they ported the character over, but they had to like rename to Zifnab in order to clear the license of the character because of TSR. That's so funny. Yeah, I think I think Fizban is inconsistent in the different short stories and novels and stuff in his approach as a character. He can be a little too slapsticky for my personal taste, but Tasselhoff is like on the money as far as comedic, timing and stuff. I mean, I think Tasselhoff is, I've said this over and over again, and so people are going to be sick of it, but Tasselhoff is the R2-D2 of Dragonlance. He saves people accidentally through his actions, but he's always the one to sort of right the wrongs and to be the driving force of doing something that seems insane, but no one else will want to do it. And he's just like, yeah, I'll go check it out. Like he's great. And he's interfaced with gods. He's interfaced with dragons directly. He's interfaced with, avatars of gods. I mean, he's gone to the abyss and back. Like he is the ultimate character of Dragonlance. He's great. I love him so much.
And he does everything with like, he's just excited about it. It's never like he's worried or anything. He's just like, let's just go. Let's.
Yeah, like
I never thought of the relationship to R2-D2, but that's a really good comparison.
Yeah, that's a good point because Tanis is always reluctant. Raistlin always has alternative, ideas in mind. Karaman is just following Raistlin. And Tasselhoff and Flint's always, just making fun of this doorknob of a Kender, but he desperately loves him as a human, as a Kender. But, he loves him as a friend. It's a great dynamic. I just think it's wonderful. All right. Well, I've taken enough of your time. Thank you so much for joining me live. I've had a really wonderful time talking to you today. Could you tell the good folks watching at home where they can find more of you?
Sure. So obviously there's my YouTube channel, which is Fantasy Fiction Fanatics. And I also have my blog, fantasyfictionfanatics.net. You can find a bunch of different kind of content on there than on my channel, as well as a connection to my channel. You can join the Discord, which I can go ahead and leave a link with you, Adam, if you want to link it for people.
Yeah.
Or you also do Twitter or Facebook, which is at FantasyFiction1.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I really do appreciate it. And I hope that the audience will go and check out your channel because you're doing a great job, and more fantasy
Thank you so much.
is all the better. I would like to say for everyone else out there, that is it for this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you guys so much for tuning in live. This is what makes these live streams worthwhile. You know, we could have easily just had a conversation amongst ourselves and then published it at a later date, but your interaction, your questions, your feedback immediately to what we're talking about is what creates this wonderful dynamic that I genuinely appreciate. So thank you so much for spending your Saturday evening with us as well. Of course, if you like what we're doing here, subscribe to Fantasy Fiction Fanatics, subscribe to Dragonlance Saga if you haven't already. Watch, like, and comment on the videos. This all helps other people learn about Fantasy Fiction Fanatics and Dragonlance, respectively. I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and until next time, Slan Javar.